With that meandering introduction out of the way, I'd like to give a bit of a table of contents to know what to expect from this larger voice recording, where the main theme is competency as well as determining a way forward. This talk is kind of like rubber duck debugging. If anyone out there listening is a programmer, then you know that a good way to figure out, well, what's going wrong with my code? If you just look at the code on the screen, sometimes it doesn't click what's happening. So if you explain it verbally, then that activates different, brain patterns that's going on. You have a different set of neurons that are firing when you are speaking out loud as opposed to just reading something from a screen. Actually, it's also interesting that if you're reading something from a piece of paper, it is a different set of neurons firing as well. And I've heard about this from one silly story when talking with online friends about rubber duck debugging. One guy that was with web development, if he couldn't figure out how things were working, because like HTML, CSS, all of that it is just text, and he'd like to print it out and then look over it that way and then make notes by hand instead of like typing. That's also a different kind of motor movement. That's a different kind of engagement. Then you have a pen in hand and you're doing things differently. And that was a real interesting thing that stuck with me, because in the writing world, because I do lots of writing and editing, that's a different way of editing on different rounds of edits so that you catch different kinds of problems. When you're just editing on a screen, then you're not going to see things the same way as if you have things printed out, just because that takes more logistically. I like doing that on the last edit where I verbally read things out loud. Then I get a better feel for how things sound, as well as, getting that different, fresh perspective on it. So that's a very interesting thing to hear of someone applying that to code of printing out a page of HTML, or like 16 pages of HTML and going through that. That helped him with his job. Anyway, I say all of that to talk about rubber duck debugging, and this is one way that I think through things, especially with decision making, and something that spurred me on to think very deliberately and to have a great amount of consideration towards how I am moving forward. Is a close friend of mine recently made a not so great decision. He made an emotional decision that led to a lot of difficulty in his current job position. And he got into a hard place because he was trying to think through things, but he was very isolated. I actually couldn't reach out to him for, it was a little over a month. So I was very nervous, and I didn't hear how things had developed for him till it was a bit after the fact. And so he has served as a word of warning towards myself to not make hasty decisions. And I know with my own impulsivity, here's something that I get from insight of watching how I play video games, because I like strategy video games like the XCOM series. And I say it very often when I'm doing voiceovers, let's not be hasty about this. I like to quote old Treebeard about that. Let's not be hasty. Yeah, no need to be hasty. But you don't want to take all day just to say good morning either. So, balance. What is it? Quae modica? All things in moderation. Anyway, I realize that it's part of my nature to be hasty with making decisions, and that is one way how I get things done. I don't have all the information about one thing or another. I could get analysis paralysis by looking over things so much. At one point, you have to go, okay, I'm just going to take this and run with it. But that could be a bad decision if you aren't looking at the whole picture. So I'm trying to talk through the whole picture with gaining competency, as well as moving forward ultimately with a career path. Right now, I'm a full-time student. I'm studying cybersecurity full-time while also pursuing hobbies that really help me with self-development, as well as give me a sense of fulfillment. A big thing that I do is writing, but I also do stuff with video games, like modding the heck out of them, and also 3D modeling. So there's actually some interesting things that I'd like to share, and also with language learning. I'm sure that unscriptedly I will bring up something or another about language learning, because that just is such a core part of my life and part of my development as well. So I want to talk about competency, and I'll bring up different examples within these different areas, like how modding relates to cybersecurity, how 3D modeling with Blender could relate to relevant skills within the cybersecurity world that are adjacent. And some of it's like soft skills. I don't know if it's proper to say it's a soft technical skill, because when we talk about a soft skill like with communication, that's a soft skill that you can't really teach and you can't really practice on. This is very hard for me to to convey the concept of a soft technical skill because there's patterns of interacting with a computer program that if you are familiar with going through the trials and tribulations of figuring out how a system works in one context, then it's not so intimidating when you have to go through the trials and tribulations of figuring out how another system works in a different context. And a big thing why I'm not afraid to get back into web development with Angular is that Pega, the prior framework that I was using a whole lot, was extremely complex with the amount of depth that was available overall, and the project that I was on was extremely ambitious. And that's why we had there's lots of people working on the same thing at once, so you have teams of developers and then you have to coordinate that. So it's like I had my little niche, but I could see the bigger picture for just how far this was going and all the things going on there. I didn't have much control over it because I'm just like one little brick in the wall. It's another wonderful figure of speech that I ran into recently quite naturally while talking to an online friend who was not a native English speaker, and I had to explain just another cog in the machine or just another brick in the wall. He was struggling to convey that feeling where he's finishing up a technical degree. He's got a master's in some STEM thing. No docs, please, even though I'm not giving his name or any information. Let's just say he's an engineer, just to keep vague about it. So he has a master's degree in engineering, and I'm extremely impressed by this. I'm like, wow, I only have a bachelor's in psychology, which I never properly used. I mean, technically I used it to get to Japan, but that's another story in all this, where it's just easier to get a visa if you have that doesn't matter because that's irrelevant. The relevant thing in my situation is that all of my technical skills are things that I learned through self-study. So I have a deep respect for people. I guess you would not expect that I would have a deep respect for people who went through a college system to stick with it and get proper credentials that way. But I do have a great respect for that. And I'm very impressed with him for, sticking with it so long and having a particular traditional career path in that manner. But at the same time, he was very impressed towards me for, learning all this stuff on my own. He's like, where did you learn this? What school did you go to? There's, different things online, and it's building a whole bunch of projects and then moving from one thing to another. In a way, I feel like even though I am a jack of all trades with knowing a little bit from here and there and not being afraid of course, researching things and having a much broader scope of things that I'm comfortable with researching, that I'm comfortable with figuring out, instead of just being purely technical towards web development, let's say. I have a perspective on cybersecurity. I even have a perspective on psychology. I have a perspective on different languages that brings more to the table and allows me to tackle more problems while still having that core understanding of these methods of approaching problems and trying to solve them. Because at the end of the day, either between web development or cybersecurity, you are solving problems at the end of the day. But that was an odd thing that when we were talking about career prospects, me and this engineer guy, he was struggling to convey the feeling of I don't want to just be another cog in the machine. I don't just want to be another brick in the wall. And when I was working at the large company with using Pega systems, I definitely felt like just another cog in the machine, not having much control over things and just being really unfulfilled. Perhaps one of the biggest nails in the coffin to make me leave was, or it's not so much leaving because you have different contracts for different jobs. Then you have a headhunter agency that they're like, okay, this contract's done, so we have another one lined up for you. But in order to have this, you have to retrain with this cohort that's going to be a couple of months, and this other thing that's completely irrelevant and completely boring with database management. That's something that I have no passion for. I'm not interested in it at all. And when I encountered that at the end of my last contract, I was like, I'm really interested in cybersecurity. I want to pursue this. And I talked to a couple of HR people about this, and both of them were like, why do you want to do that? That has nothing to do with your current, your current skill set. I mean, you're doing web development. And my first instinct now, looking back, is going, do you know anything about web exploitations? I mean, that's an entire category of attack. And if you know how web development works, even just with basics of, I've built websites, I've built applications within websites, I've built functionality within websites. I understand, I've had to implement error checking on fields and even test those fields with test for SQL injection, for example. And they actually really didn't like that when I demonstrated that there would be a possible vulnerability for SQL injection. So make sure that the next team that does these configurations that gets passed down to the pipeline disallows certain, backticks and things that I didn't have control over from the access group that I was part of. So there's silly things like that where to the technical team, it's like, oh yeah, this is very important. But then to the business team, it's kind of intimidating and stuff. That doesn't matter though. So part of it is my rebellious nature of wanting to do something that someone said I can't do, but this is something where I don't know if I'm passionate about cybersecurity or not because I've never been able to give it a fair shake. And something that really set me on cybersecurity proper was when studying for Security Plus, just going over a couple of textbooks there, how much I enjoyed the physical security aspect of it, of considering, well, how would I build a facility, and, in these conditions, what would I want to have for, just setting up physical security, and just speculating about that was very fascinating to me. Also looking up how to get started in cybersecurity. It appears, I was given the impression that a lot of people who want to get into cybersecurity are really focused on pen testing, because that's the cool, sexy part of cybersecurity, but they're not so much interested in configuring updates to make sure that a network within a business is less vulnerable. There's also more to cybersecurity than just penetration testing, than just trying to get access to another computer. There's, the whole blue team aspect of trying to stop people from getting access to it. And then there's the physical aspect of, on the red team, infiltration, and on the blue team, what can we have in place to prevent infiltration? Do we have locks on these windows that are accessible from street level? Because someone could just open up the window and pop right in. And then if you have physical access to anything, you have physical access to devices, that opens up a whole mess of problems. That's something that's also, some things are taken for granted. If an attacker has physical access to your network, but let's say that you have like all the software prim and proper with being really tight with security, but they're able to get a malicious physical device bugging out your network, then that's absolutely a vulnerability that exists beyond the technical side. Technically you have technical controls. Wow, I am repeating some words here. There's a category of controls that are called technical controls. I believe it's a technical control, is a technical preventative control. If you have a smart lock, like you need an RFID chip as a proximity key to open up a door, then that's a technical implementation. A restricted access area, which would be a preventative measure. If someone doesn't have the RFID chip, then they can't enter through that door, and that would restrict access to physical devices that are important. And then you can get into other speculations. This is like how my brain works, of talking about generalities, so my brain is more likely to jump to different things. If to secure your physical assets, your physical network, you would have to put in these smart locks, or you'd have to implement cages around the server so that you can't physically access them and put weird devices and stuff on it. If you need to make these serious physical changes, then it might be a good idea to migrate things to a cloud service, and that's another talk in and of itself, which is something that I'm interested in learning more about. Long story short from that, my previous employer did not support retraining in something that I was interested in, and because I have the competency of look, I learned German on my own. I learned Japanese largely on my own. I had university courses for that, but I learned Polish on my own, and I was able to go to Poland and speak Polish with Polish people. And it took a while to get into it, but I was able to have no problems with communicating at a conversational level, starting from nothing and learning completely on my own. The takeaway from this recording is that you don't necessarily need, a stamp of approval from a university in order to learn something. You are not helpless in needing to have some expert teach you things. It does take a lot of effort, and you do have to be smart about the way that you study, which is why I am talking through this and trying to figure out what is the smart way that I want to study this, but also this development of competency, this renewed trust that I have in myself, that I can gain necessary skills, that I can do things and I can do them well, even if I don't have lots of social accolades for the accomplishments that I have been able to make. And even if it's not seen as it's not prestigious or whatever to be modding video games or to make models in Blender, that there are key things that I've learned from that which have really helped my development in terms of understanding technical things and being able to attack technical issues and solve technical problems. But until the next episode, thank you very much for watching, and I will continue on with this talk as we get into those examples a little more on the technical side of how this self-development applies to cybersecurity concepts.